My name is Clara. The house felt different now, quieter, emptier. But I wasn't sure if it was the house that had changed, or if it was just me. When Daniel and I first moved here 7 years ago, our home on Briarwood Lane was full of promise. A spacious porch for slow mornings, a garden to nurture dreams, and enough room to grow together. But houses, like people, don't always stay the same. Or maybe they don't change at all. Maybe they just show you their true nature over time. Before we get into the details, write in the comments where you're watching this video from. Lately, the silence felt suffocating, pressing in on the spaces where our laughter used to echo. Daniel wasn't a bad man, not at all. He was hardworking, responsible, steady. He never raised his voice or acted cruelly. But perhaps that was part of the problem. He had become too measured, too controlled, too distant. Every evening, he'd come home, press a brief kiss to my forehead like it was an item on his to-do list, and retreat to his study. The glow of his laptop became the only warmth he seemed to need. At some point, I stopped asking for more. It was a scorching August afternoon when I found myself wrestling with the garden hose, trying to keep my hydrangeas from succumbing to the relentless heat. The hose twisted stubbornly, refusing to cooperate, when a voice called out from the other side of the hedge. "Hey there! Need a hand?" I turned and saw him, leaning casually over the hedge, hair damp with sweat, a rake slung over his shoulder. He looked like he belonged on the cover of an outdoor adventure magazine, sun-kissed, easygoing, effortlessly charming. "Oh, no, I've got it," I said, fumbling with the hose to prove my point. He grinned, clearly unconvinced. "Sure you do." Then, with a swift, fluid motion, he vaulted over the hedge and landed beside me. "Name's Jamie. Just moved into the blue house down the street." There was something about him, an energy, a warmth, that made the air around me feel lighter. He wasn't intrusive, just naturally comfortable in the space he occupied. "Clara," I replied. "Welcome to the neighborhood." Jamie reached for the hose and, within seconds, untangled it with ease. He adjusted the nozzle and sent a perfect spray of water over the thirsty hydrangeas. "There," he said, turning off the spigot. Crisis averted. I tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear, suddenly self-conscious of my sweat-dampened shirt and dirt-smudged hands. "Thanks. I usually handle things on my own." Jamie studied me for a beat longer than expected, his expression thoughtful. "Well, maybe you don't have to. Not all the time." Something in his words settled deep inside me, but I didn't know what to do with it. Before I could overthink, Jamie gave me a casual wave and jogged back toward his yard. A scruffy dog, which I hadn't even noticed before, bounded after him. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my reflection in the window. Outside, the hose lay neatly coiled, the hydrangeas standing tall and refreshed. But my mind was stuck on what Jamie had said. "Maybe you don't have to." And for the first time in a long while, I let myself wonder, what if he was right? The next time I saw Jamie, it was early morning. The sky was painted with soft pink hues, and the world felt hushed, as if it hadn't fully woken up yet. He was jogging with his dog, Max, his pace easy and unhurried, like he was greeting the day rather than racing through it. "Morning, Clara," he called, flashing that effortless grin. "Good morning," I replied, my voice uncertain. I wasn't sure why I hesitated, maybe because I wasn't used to being noticed anymore. But I couldn't deny it, I was glad to see him. After that, Jamie seemed to appear more often. He'd wave while mowing his lawn, stop for a chat while walking Max, or simply linger by the hedge with an easy, unforced presence. He always asked how my day was going, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I found myself answering honestly. "Quiet," I admitted one afternoon, as we spoke over the hedge. "Too quiet sometimes." Jamie nodded, his expression unreadable. Quiet's not always a bad thing. But if it feels heavy, that's different. He said things like that often, simple, thoughtful observations that lingered in my mind long after he walked away. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed real conversation. Someone listening, really listening, instead of scrolling through emails or checking their watch mid-sentence. Daniel hadn't noticed Jamie. Or if he had, he hadn't mentioned it. His world was spreadsheets, late-night calls, and a phone that never left his hand. And I had long since stopped trying to compete for space in it. But Jamie noticed me. The first time he knocked on my door, I wasn't expecting it. When I opened it, he stood there, toolbox in hand, looking entirely at ease. "Hey, Clara," he said, like we were old friends. "Your gutter's barely hanging on. Want me to take a look?" For a moment, I hesitated. Letting him in felt like crossing some invisible line. But then I stepped aside. Jamie climbed the ladder with practiced ease, inspecting the damage while I stood below, shifting on my feet. The summer heat clung to the air, and as I watched him work, I felt strangely self-conscious, like I should have been more prepared for company, even if it was just a neighbor fixing something. "You weren't kidding," he called down, shaking his head. "This thing's holding on by sheer willpower." I let out a short laugh, crossing my arms. "That's been a theme around here lately." Jamie paused, glancing over his shoulder. That look again, the one that felt like he saw more than I was saying. It made me want to look away and hold his gaze all at once. "Well," he said, turning back to his work, "let's give it something sturdier than willpower." It didn't take him long to secure the gutter. When he hopped down, wiping his hands on his jeans, he shot me a lopsided grin. "Good as new." "Thank you," I said, meaning it more than I intended. "Can I get you something? Water? Lemonade?" "Lemonade sounds great." I busied myself in the kitchen, grateful for something to do with my hands. When I returned with 2 glasses, Jamie was leaning against the porch railing. Max sprawled at his feet. He took the glass with a quiet thanks, and we sipped in silence for a while. It wasn't awkward, just easy. "Do you ever stop to enjoy this?" Jamie asked, nodding toward the garden. I followed his gaze. The flower beds I fussed over, the trees whose shade I never sat beneath. "Not as much as I probably should." "You should," he said simply. "It's nice here. Peaceful." I smiled, though something about his words felt bittersweet. "Sometimes it's a little too peaceful." Jamie nodded like he understood. "Loneliness has a way of sneaking up on you." The words settled heavily between us. I swallowed hard and looked away, feeling like he'd touched a nerve I hadn't realized was exposed. When he left that afternoon, the house felt bigger than usual, and the silence felt even louder. The days passed in their usual rhythm, or lack thereof. Daniel worked late more often, and even when he was home, he wasn't really there. I found myself thinking about Jamie at the oddest moments, his laugh, the way he said my name, the way it felt to be noticed again. It wasn't intentional, but I started spending more time on the porch. Some evenings, I'd bring out my sketchbook, an old habit I had abandoned long ago. I wasn't sure what made me dust it off, but holding it felt like reclaiming something I had lost. The next time Jamie stopped by, he noticed immediately. He was carrying a bag of fresh tomatoes from the farmer's market, Max trotting at his heels. "You're an artist?" he asked, his voice curious but not prying. "I used to be," I said, running my fingers over the cover. "It's been a while." "Mind if I see?" I hesitated, then handed it over. The sketches were simple: flowers, the trees in the yard, Max chasing a stick. Jamie flipped through the pages, nodding thoughtfully. "These are great," he said. "You've got talent." I felt my cheeks warm. It had been so long since someone said that. "Thank you. I guess I'm a little rusty." "Rusty or not, it's still there," Jamie said, handing the sketchbook back. "You should keep at it." His words lingered long after he left. That night, I stayed up sketching until my hand cramped, the quiet hum of inspiration stirring again. It was late when Daniel finally came home. I was still at the kitchen table, lost in my drawings, pencils scattered around me. He stopped in the doorway, his brow furrowing slightly. "What's all this?" "Just drawing," I said, keeping my voice casual. Daniel nodded slowly, like he didn't quite understand. "I'm heading to bed," he said after a pause. "Don't stay up too late." "I won't," I replied, though I didn't look up. The door to his study creaked shut, and I let out a slow breath, staring down at the half-finished sketch in front of me, a field of wildflowers, ones Jamie had brought me a few days before. A lump formed in my throat, heavy and unshakable. Jamie knocked on my door the next afternoon, a box of tools in one hand and that easy, familiar smile on his face. "What needs fixing today?" he asked. I laughed, shaking my head. "You're going to run out of projects if you keep this up." "Good thing I don't mind," he said, eyes glinting with something both familiar and dangerous. As he worked, I found myself watching him more than I should have. The way his hands moved with certainty, the way his shirt clung to his shoulders in the summer heat. I told myself I was just observing, nothing more. "You okay?" Jamie asked, glancing at me mid-task. I nodded too quickly. "Of course." But even as I said it, I knew I was lying. I had never thought of myself as someone who needed saving, but every time Jamie was around, I felt like I was being pulled out of something I hadn't even realized I was drowning in. And that terrified me. The day started like most others. Daniel had left early, his half-empty coffee cup abandoned on the counter. I moved through the house, tidying up, filling the silence with small tasks. But by late morning, I was outside, trimming the overgrown rose bushes, needing something to keep my hands busy. That's when Jamie appeared at the gate, Max trotting faithfully beside him. "You're going to hurt yourself with those clippers," he teased, leaning against the fence. I rolled my eyes but couldn't hide my smile. "I've been doing this for years, Jamie. I think I can handle it. Let me help." He was already unlatched the gate before I could protest. I could have stopped him. I could have told him to go home. But I didn't. Jamie had a way of stepping into my space without it feeling like an intrusion. And maybe that was the part one was starting to fear the most. How much I welcomed it. We worked side by side, the sun beating down on our backs, the scent of fresh roses thick in the air. The moment felt normal. Easy. Until our fingers brushed as I handed him a pair of gloves. It was nothing, a fleeting touch, barely noticeable, but it sent a jolt through me, like static after walking across carpet. I sucked in a sharp breath and looked at Jamie. And he was already looking at me. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held something steady, something deep. "You okay?" he asked softly. I turned back to the roses, suddenly focused on a particularly stubborn branch.
"Fine, I murmurd."
But I wasn't. Not even close. That afternoon, Jamie knocked on my door again, this time holding a small canvas wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" I asked, confused. "Something I found at the flea market," he said, handing it to me. "Thought you might like it." I unwrapped the paper carefully, revealing a painting, small, but full of life. A meadow bathed in twilight, colors bold and wild, untouched by hesitation. It reminded me of the kind of scenes I used to paint before I stopped. "It's beautiful," I murmured, my fingers tracing the edge of the canvas. Jamie smiled, a flicker of mischief in his eyes. "I figured it might inspire you. You've got talent, Clara. Don't let it go to waste." His words hit me harder than I expected. It had been so long since someone looked at me and saw something more than a wife, a hostess, someone to be passed over. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Thank you. Anytime." His voice was soft, steady. That night, I sat in the kitchen, staring at the painting propped up against the counter. I wanted to paint again, to lose myself in colors and movement and creation. But at the same time, I wanted to shove the canvas into a closet and pretend it didn't exist. By the time Daniel came home, I still hadn't touched it. He walked into the kitchen, glancing at the painting as he sorted through the mail. "What's this?" he asked. "Just something I picked up." I lied. He didn't question it. He muttered something about an early meeting and disappeared into his study, door clicking shut behind him. I watched him go, the weight in my chest growing heavier. Jamie and I didn't talk about the painting after that, but something between us shifted. He started coming around more often. Sometimes he'd show up with a project in mind, a loose step on the porch, a stubborn gate latch. Other times he had no excuse at all. And each time, the tension between us grew. A quiet, undeniable pull that we both pretended not to notice. One evening, he showed up with Max and suggested a walk. "It's too nice a night to be stuck inside," he said, holding the gate open for me. I hesitated. I should have said no. But the thought of sitting in that house, alone, felt unbearable. So I grabbed my jacket and followed him. The air was crisp, the kind that signaled the beginning of fall. We walked in silence at first, the gravel crunching beneath our feet, Max trotting happily ahead. But when we reached the edge of the meadow, Jamie stopped. He turned to me, his gaze steady. "You seem happier." I frowned slightly.
Doi.
He nodded.
Yeah.
Lighter. Like you're starting to let go of something. I wasn't sure how to respond to that. Because he wasn't wrong. "Maybe I am," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Jamie smiled, but there was something else in his eyes. Something deeper. "Good," he said. "You deserve that." I didn't answer. My chest ached with the weight of his words. When we reached my house again, Jamie hesitated on the porch. "Clara," he said, his tone quieter now. "Yes. I know I shouldn't say this," but he exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "I think about you. A lot." The words landed between us, charged and heavy, unraveling something I had been trying to ignore. My breath caught. "You shouldn't," I whispered. Jamie gave a small, rueful smile. "I know." He turned to go, but before he stepped off the porch, he looked back at me one last time. His expression was soft but full of something that made my heart race. "Good night, Clara." I swallowed hard. Good night. I watched him disappear into the night, something deep inside me stirring. Something I didn't know how to stop. The next few days passed in a haze. I kept busy with chores, errands, anything to keep my mind from drifting back to Jamie. But it was useless. His words followed me everywhere. "I think about you. A lot." It wasn't just the words themselves, but the way he said them. Quiet, certain, like he had been holding them in for too long. Like he couldn't keep them inside any longer. I didn't tell anyone, of course. Who would I tell? Daniel, and I barely spoke about the ordinary details of our lives, let alone the tangled mess of emotions I found myself caught in. But Daniel's absence felt heavier now, his silence more oppressive. By midweek, I found myself glancing out the window more often, wondering if Jamie would stop by. When he didn't, I told myself it was for the best. I couldn't keep leaning on him. I couldn't let this, whatever this was, take root. But by Friday, I was on the porch steps, staring down at Max as he bounded toward me, Jamie trailing just a few paces behind. "Morning, Clara," Jamie said, his voice easy, like nothing had shifted between us. "Morning," I replied, forcing my tone to be neutral. He held up a small toolbox. "Noticed the porch steps a little loose. Thought I'd fix it before someone takes a nasty fall." I hesitated. I should have told him not to bother, that it wasn't necessary. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I stepped aside and let him in. Jamie worked quietly, the rhythmic sound of his hammer filling the space between us. I busied myself sweeping the kitchen, but I kept stealing glances at him. The way his arms flexed as he worked, the way he focused, unwavering, like everything he did was done with intention. When he finished, he stood and dusted his hands on his jeans. "All set," he said, flashing that easy grin. "Thank you," I said softly, setting the broom aside. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us shifted, charged with something unsaid, something that had been building for weeks. "Clara," Jamie began, his voice low. I shook my head, cutting him off. "You should go." His jaw tightened, but he nodded. "If that's what you want." It wasn't. But I didn't say that. That night, Daniel came home earlier than usual. He seemed to notice something he hadn't noticed in a long time. "You've been quiet lately," he said, watching me across the dinner table. "Have I?" I kept my voice even. He nodded, studying me.
Yeah.
"Is everything okay?" For a brief moment, I wanted to tell him everything. About the loneliness, the silence, The way Jamie had stepped into the empty spaces Daniel had ignored for years. But the words never came. Instead, I offered a small smile.
Ivy fine.
Daniel didn't press further. He never did. And that, I realized, was the real problem. I tried to stay away from Jamie after that. I really did. For days, I stuck to the house, throwing myself into mindless tasks, organizing drawers, scrubbing floors that weren't dirty, anything to keep my hands busy. If I stayed occupied, I wouldn't have time to think about the way Jamie looked at me, the way my heart betrayed me every time he was near. But avoidance only worked for so long. One afternoon, I decided to take a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The neighborhood was quiet, the early autumn breeze crisp against my skin. I kept my pace slow, following a familiar path through the meadow behind the houses. And that's when I saw him. Jamie was sitting on the grass, one arm draped lazily over Max as the dog dozed beside him. He wasn't looking at me, but I had the distinct feeling he knew I was there. "You avoiding me?" he asked, his tone light, but his eyes serious as he turned to face me. I hesitated, hugging my arms around myself. "I'm trying to do the right thing." Jamie gave a small nod, as if he understood. "And how's that working out for you?" I looked away. I didn't have an answer for that. Jamie stood, closing the distance between us with a few easy strides. He didn't touch me, but I felt him, his presence, his warmth, the quiet pull that had been there from the start. "I don't want to make things harder for you, Clara," he said gently. "But I can't pretend there's nothing here." My chest tightened. "Jamie, this isn't fair."
To you. To me.
"To anyone." "Maybe not." His voice was steady, certain. "But it's real." His words settled deep inside me, and for a moment, I let myself feel them. Let myself acknowledge that something inside me had already changed, that maybe it had been changing for a long time. "I don't know how to fix this," I whispered. Jamie exhaled, his eyes never leaving mine. "Maybe it's not about fixing. Maybe it's about letting yourself feel again." The way he said it, so quiet, so sure, it unraveled something in me. And before I could stop myself, I reached for his hand. It was the smallest of touches, my fingers brushing against his. But it was enough. Enough to shatter the distance I had been trying so hard to keep. When I got home that evening, the house felt colder than usual. Daniel's car wasn't in the driveway, which meant he was working late, again. The silence pressed down on me, heavier than ever. I walked into the kitchen, my eyes landing on the vase of sunflowers sitting on the counter. Their bright yellow petals were starting to curl at the edges, wilting from neglect. Just like everything else. I reached out, running my fingers along one of the brittle stems. A lump formed in my throat. I didn't know if it was guilt or something else entirely. I had held Jamie's hand. Only for a moment, only a whisper of contact. But it felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. And the worst part? I didn't regret it. Jamie kept his distance for the next few days. I told myself it was for the best. That space would help settle whatever was unraveling between us. But I missed him. I missed his easy laughter, the way his presence filled the empty spaces I hadn't even realized were hollow. I missed feeling seen. By the time Friday rolled around, I was sitting on the porch, sketchbook in hand, though I hadn't turned a page in hours. I was staring out at the street when I saw Max trotting up the driveway, tail wagging. And just a few steps behind him, Jamie. My heart lurched before I could stop it. "Morning, Clara," he said, voice light but careful, like he wasn't sure if I wanted him there. "Morning," I replied, closing my sketchbook and setting it aside. Jamie hesitated, then held up a small basket. "Farmers market's in town today. Thought you might want to come along." I should have said no.
I knew I should have.
But instead, I found myself nodding. That sounds nice. The market was bustling with life, bright stalls overflowing with fresh produce, wildflowers bundled in twine, the smell of roasted coffee and baked bread filling the crisp autumn air. Jamie led the way, stopping here and there to pick up small things. A few apples, a loaf of sourdough, a bouquet of sunflowers. He handed them to me without a word. For the kitchen, he finally said. I let out a soft laugh. You're going to spoil me, you know. Jamie's gaze was steady, his voice quieter this time. Maybe you deserve to be spoiled. The word sent a shiver through me. For the rest of the morning, I let myself exist in the moment. We walked through the stalls, the weight in my chest a little lighter than it had been in weeks. And for a few hours, I let myself forget the way my life was supposed to be. But when we pulled up in front of my house, reality came crashing back. Jamie turned off the engine, but didn't move to get out. Neither did I. Thanks for coming with me, he said after a moment. I swallowed, still holding the sunflowers in my lap. Thanks for asking me. Jamie exhaled slowly, fingers drumming lightly on the steering wheel. Clara. I shook my head, cutting him off before he could say something I wasn't ready to hear. Jamie, we can't. Why not? His voice was gentle but insistent. Because. My throat felt tight. It's not fair.
To you. To me.
To anyone. Jamie studied me, his jaw tightening just slightly. I don't want to make things harder for you. But I also can't pretend this doesn't mean something. I turned away, staring at the house where my husband would eventually come home, unaware of the storm brewing inside me. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Jamie reached out then, his fingers brushing lightly over mine. Just a touch. Just enough to send my pulse racing. You don't have to know, he said softly. Not right now. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. As I stepped out of the truck and watched Jamie drive away, the sunflowers clutched tightly in my arms, I knew I was standing on the edge of something dangerous. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to step back. By the time Daniel got home that night, I had already put the sunflowers in a vase on the kitchen counter. Their vibrant yellow looked out of place against the muted tones of our house. Too bright, too alive. Daniel walked in, loosening his tie as he glanced around. His eyes landed on the flowers. Where'd these come from? He asked. The farmer's market, I said, keeping my voice even. He nodded absently, flipping through the mail. He didn't ask why I'd gone, or who I'd gone with. He never asked those kinds of questions. Dinner was quiet, as it always was. Daniel scrolled through his phone between bites, distracted, detached. I barely touched my food, my thoughts tangled in a mess of what-ifs and maybes. When he finally muttered something about an early meeting and went to bed, I sat at the table long after he was gone, staring at the vase of sunflowers. I had been fooling myself. This wasn't just harmless companionship anymore. This was something else entirely. Jamie didn't come by the next day.
Or the day after that.
At first, I told myself it was a good thing. Distance would help. It had to. But by the time a week had passed, I found myself standing on the porch, looking down the street, waiting for a glimpse of him. And when I finally saw him, walking Max, his expression unreadable, it took everything in me not to call out to him. Instead, I gripped the railing and stayed where I was, my heart pounding for reasons I didn't want to examine. Friday came. I was in the garden, pulling weeds with more force than necessary, when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, my breath catching as I saw Jamie standing at the gate. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he nodded toward the loose step on the porch. I can fix that for you if you want. I swallowed hard. Jamie. You don't have to say anything, he interrupted gently. Just let me help. And for some reason I did. I opened the gate and let him in. He worked quietly, the rhythmic sound of the hammer filling the air. I sat on the porch steps, watching his hands move with practiced ease. When he finished, he wiped his palms on his jeans and looked at me. All set. Thank you, I said, my voice softer than I intended. Jamie hesitated, then sat down beside me. For a long time, we just sat there. The weight of everything unspoken pressed between us, heavy and undeniable. Then Jamie turned to me, his voice quieter this time. Clara, tell me to leave if that's what you want. I opened my mouth, but no words came, because I didn't want him to leave. And that terrified me more than anything. I should have told him to go. I should have drawn the line, put an end to whatever this was before it went too far. But I didn't. Instead, we sat there in silence, the distance between us narrowing in ways that had nothing to do with space. Jamie exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. I don't want to make things harder for you, Clara. I know. My voice was barely above a whisper. But I also don't want to pretend this doesn't mean something, he continued. I swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the porch step. Jamie, this isn't fair. To who? He asked, his gaze steady. Daniel? You? To all of us, I admitted, my throat tightening. Jamie nodded, as if he understood. Then tell me to leave. I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come.
Because I didn't want him to.
His expression softened. He reached for my hand, not forcefully, not urgently, just a quiet offering. My fingers twitched, a heartbeat away from his. And then the sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the moment. Daniel was home. I jerked back as if burned, standing too quickly. Jamie's expression darkened for just a second before he masked it with something unreadable. I should go, he said, his voice even. I nodded, unable to look at him. Jamie hesitated for half a breath, then turned and walked away, disappearing down the street with Max trailing behind him. By the time Daniel stepped through the front door, I was already in the kitchen, hands gripping the edge of the counter, trying to steady myself. Hey, he said casually, setting his briefcase down. How was your day? The question caught me off guard. Daniel never asked that. And for the first time in years, I realized he was looking at me.
Not past me.
Not through me.
At me.
Something twisted deep in my chest. It was fine, I said, forcing a smile. Just fine. And I wondered when I had gotten so good at lying. Part 10 of 10. Jamie didn't come by after that.
Days passed.
Then weeks. At first, I told myself it was for the best. Distance would make things easier. But the absence of him, of his voice, his presence, the quiet warmth he carried with him, only made the silence in my life more unbearable. Daniel noticed the shift in me. I caught him watching me sometimes, a flicker of something in his expression that I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was suspicion. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe he had finally started seeing what had been in front of him all along. One evening, he came home early. He set the table, opened a bottle of wine. I thought we could have a nice dinner, he said. I nodded, but my chest ached with something I couldn't name. We ate in near silence, the sound of silverware scraping against plates the only thing filling the room. Then, halfway through the meal, Daniel set down his fork. Clara, he said, his voice measured, careful. Is there something you want to tell me? The question hit like a slap. I swallowed hard, fingers tightening around my napkin. There it was. A door, cracked open. I could tell him. I could lay it all out. The loneliness, the emptiness, the way I had started to disappear inside this marriage long before Jamie ever stepped into my life. But I didn't. Instead, I forced a smile. No, I said, my voice steady. Nothing at all. Daniel held my gaze for a long moment.
He didn't argue.
He didn't press. And somehow that hurt more than if he had. Because deep down I knew he already had his answer. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I had spent so long convincing myself that I was fine, that this life, this quiet, hollow life was enough. But Jamie had shown me something I wasn't ready to face. I wanted more. I deserved more. And I didn't know what scared me more, staying in a life that no longer felt like mine, or finally stepping out of it. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's discuss if this story resonated with you. Support the channel, like, subscribe, and click on the bell to not miss new episodes. Let's talk together about things that really matter.